All right, we're going to get started on our last session of the afternoon. Thanks for hanging around with us today. I'm Yara Fisher. I'm going to be talking about CEQA and our travel modeling and forecasting and some of the barriers and challenges that our traditional CEQA processes and traffic impact analyses may cause in TOD development. I'm going to go over some recent legislation really quickly, but focus a little bit on SB 743 and talk about how that's leading to some evolving methodology and some tools that we're using that may help us develop some strategies to support TOD. So that's what we're going to do with this discussion, and Bob Leiter and Clint Daniels will be helping me out a little bit. So CEQA. I have been practicing CEQA for almost 17 years now as a consultant, mostly for public agencies, but also a little bit with private agencies. And I can say I really do have a love-hate relationship with CEQA, and I think probably many people in this room do that use it on a normal basis. It's a great tool for providing information to the public, to elicit, public input on projects and look at ways to minimize impacts. But it can also seem like a never-ending target of we're trying to, things keep moving on us with CEQA, and so it can make it a little bit difficult to implement the process. We see changes with case law, we see changes with CEQA legislation, and if you're an applicant, almost every agency, local agency you go to, lead agency, will have different CEQA guidance and standards for, how they want to see their documents done. So it can be a little bit confusing. I know oftentimes it's one of the most lengthy, costly, and probably time-consuming portions of the development process. And it's also one that is risky because it's usually the environmental document that's challenged on a project and not actually the project itself. So there's a lot of effort that goes into EIRs to make sure we're doing, a great job, but there are also some things that, kind of cause some barriers and challenges when we're trying to do development, particularly TOD. So beyond the general problems with the process with CEQA sometimes is that the process in the past and the traditional methods for analyzing traffic impacts has really been focused on vehicle congestion. We've used the level of service standards for a very long time to analyze traffic impacts. And what this has caused us to do sometimes is forget about some of those other project benefits that we would like to see. And it also causes us to focus on mitigation and other strategies that are very auto-based rather than, say, pedestrian or bicycle-based. So we're not maybe balancing some of the goals and, project goals that we would like to see very well when we're just focusing on auto-congestion measures like LOS. So recent legislation, SB 375 isn't terribly recent. Back in 2008, to help implement AB 32, SB 375 was passed and adopted to tie better our land use and transportation planning together in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It also had some accommodations and incentives in there for transit priority projects to help kind of streamline those through the environmental process. SB 226 came next in 2011, and this was the streamlining for infill projects. It was actually taken into CEQA sections, and I think Bob and I talked about this. It was very confusing bill. It was confusing the way it was put into CEQA, and we don't really know even of any projects or agencies that actually successfully streamlined, any of their projects using that bill. Is there anybody in this room that did so? So hopefully we're kind of moving past those, past SB 226, and really now focusing on SB 743. And this was requiring OPR to develop guidance for analysis guidelines to promote a reduction in GHG rather than just reduction in traffic congestion. And it also provided very specific measures for streamlining of projects in transit priority areas. Some of the streamlining benefits that were actually and have been enacted since last January are not needing to look at certain aesthetics or parking impacts for projects, but also pretty much exempting projects that have a specific plan that has a certified EIR and that is consistent with a sustainable community strategy. So those are some of the things that have been in effect for almost a year now, and I think Bob will talk a little bit later about an agency that's already using some of those streamlining benefits. So if many of you have been following the SB 743, in August, OPR released the draft guidelines, so they've been out there a while. They've had many workshops on them. I have attended several, and I've seen a lot of you there as well. I also have looked at many of the comments. A bunch of comments from public agencies, private organizations have come in, and there are concerns, of course, with SB 743, particularly with the movement of concern of removing LOS completely and how that might affect transportation planning, fees, capital improvement projects. And also how we're going to measure VMT and VMT per capita using regional averages. Are our models able to do that? Questions such as those. But one of the main recommendations is moving to more of a VMT or vehicle miles traveled sort of tool or analysis methodology. And a lot of the comments seem to kind of agree that VMT seems like, that's a pretty good way to go, but there may be other things that we want to look at, such as accessibility, pedestrian, safety, and other things like that. So those kind of summarize some of the comments that I've seen on that. And we're not exactly sure if these draft guidelines are going to be resubmitted for public comment or review, or when they may be updating them and actually sort of proposing them to be part of the guidelines. So one of the evolving methodologies that we've talked about is some of the agencies already have kind of seen this coming and have started moving toward different ways of analyzing traffic impacts in their community. So they're moving away from solely just LOS, and we'll have a couple of examples of that, using VMT and other metrics to analyze transportation impacts in their community. And we're also seeing the use of more sensitive models like activity-based models, which can hopefully help us with some of our traffic analyses. And the new activity-based model is going to be like the primary forecasting tool used for this region. Other cities that are using that tool are San Francisco, Atlanta, Chicago, Phoenix. Those are some examples of other communities. And I just wanted to give Clint a little bit of an opportunity to describe just some of the major features of the ABM.
So just briefly, as Yara was mentioning, at SANDAG we've begun the implementation of our new activity-based model. We're transitioning away from our four-step travel demand model that we've been using more or less for the last 30 or 40 years with significant improvements along the way. One of the things I always like to talk about when I talk about the activity-based model is that, number one, it's not some godsend that's going to change the way that every project looks inside of that modeling framework. But more importantly, what it does is it produces results with a finer, richer picture. So it's the same results at the end of the day, but it's a richer set of results in that analysis. So the analogy that I like to use a lot of times, maybe a bit of an old analogy, but it's the transition from a black and white television to a color television, right? It's the same television show at the end of the day, but you have a lot more richness in that picture that you're seeing on the television. Maybe a more modern example is from a television to an HD TV concept. So we're excited about this project. We're also actively engaging in enhancements to the activity-based model even before we've fully brought it online to include active transportation sensitivity within the model. So now we're actually assigning bicycle trips across the network. We've improved mode choice sensitivity to include bicycle and pedestrian improvements so that we now see the impacts of bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And we've been working hard to update the data that the model is calibrated against, reflecting the latest travel surveys and travel information in the region. So we'll be bringing this model to a city near you here in San Diego in the next 6 months or so. We're finalizing a task order at SANDAG to make the activity-based model ready for Service Bureau projects where a lot of this traffic analysis and traffic impacts happen in the modeling framework through our Service Bureau.
So in light of some of the work that's been coming out and working toward more complete, healthy, sustainable communities, a lot of agencies have, been updating their plans to include more land use design, mobility based plans, and a lot of agencies like San Marcos have completed, complete street policies. They've incorporated those into their updated general plans, but haven't really gone much further than that. San Marcos was a little bit unique, and this was done a few years ago, in that they have an urban core area, which is sort of the heart of their community. It aligns with the mixed-use transit corridors of the SANDAG Smart Growth Concept Map. And what they really decided to do was they wanted these to be activity centers in their community, and they had other goals. And so they have alternative LOS in these areas where they're allowing at least a reduced level of service in these areas. It's still vehicular based, but it's one of the first time that I saw a community kind of, do some sort of alternative LOS. They also have a commitment to reevaluate these locations as needed. And I've also kind of identified some of the preferred mode types by street typologies, so that improvements based on their street type that they have in their system may be, their preferred mode, and then that street type might be bicycle or ped rather than vehicle. So it kind of gives you a good feel of, where we should maybe be making our improvements. Pasadena recently, I think this was in October, maybe? October, around that time, adopted alternative standards to LOS, which include criteria such as VMT per capita, pedestrian accessibility, modified LOS and street segment analysis for areas within transit priority areas, and infill opportunity zones. So what they did was they actually mapped their transit priority areas and their infill opportunity zones, and then identified modified LOS criteria for these areas. And they also maintained options for traditional LOS of projects of significant size to them, but I think the significant size in this case was 50 units or more, or 50,000 square feet of retail. So that's something interesting that Pasadena has done recently. And I think we talked a little bit about the city of Los Angeles earlier, and they too in August adopted updated traffic study policies and procedures. And this kind of goes to a question I think you asked earlier, Elise, is they really, the focus of their updated traffic study policies and procedures was to minimize the demand for trips by single occupant vehicles. So they're looking for different strategies. They're encouraging other modes of travel like public transit and bicycling. And it seems like they're trying to lay out a real collaborative process with their developers and the private side to work with them through their traffic study. So that could have a little bit be of interest to you. And some of the ideas for consideration based on what we've seen other agencies doing and where we think things may be going are some streamlined review processes that you may be able to use even in this interim if SB 743 isn't, moved forward, if we still don't have alternative criteria, some other things that we could do. Bob was going to talk about some examples there.
Thanks. Well, as Yara mentioned, Senate Bill 743 is a pretty significant piece of legislation that has really gotten the attention of a lot of folks, and has also generated a lot of debate about exactly what it means and how it's going to work. And I think a lot of us have been involved now for the last year or so in evaluating it, trying to figure out ways to understand how it would work, particularly in transit priority areas. And I know one of the comments that SANDAG made in their letter of comments on the draft that was issued back in August was that it would really make sense for the Office of Planning and Research to focus first on implementing SB 743 in transit priority areas, because that's really where I think it could have the most significant effect, is to promote the use of alternative metrics in areas that we know are most likely to have a higher transit mode share and where level of service analysis isn't going to be as critical. One of the things I wanted to mention is I think there are some cities that are already moving in that direction. I would sort of call pre-SB 743 transportation planning. And to me, one of the most significant efforts in that regard is the city of Pasadena. They've been working on this now for several years. They have a transportation department director who is a planner and an engineer and understands sort of the relationship between investment decisions in transit and roads and how they affect quality of life and how they can be measured, how the performance of your transportation system can be measured in areas near transit in ways that are more useful than just looking at deterioration of roadway level of service. And so the city of Pasadena has done some really good research and analysis, and their most recent program, which has been discussed by their planning commission and city council, I think is a significant step in the right direction. I think one of the things that SANDAG and the local jurisdictions in this region should be thinking about is, let's look at some programs like that, see if there's some things we can do in the short run in anticipation of SB 743 being implemented and the guidelines being put into place. Another city in this region that I'm familiar with that's done some of the same kind of work is the city of Chula Vista. And in the Palomar Gateway area, which is the area surrounding the Palomar transit station on the Blue Line, a couple of years ago, the city of Chula Vista received a grant from SANDAG to do an innovative approach to transit planning and land use planning. And part of that was instead of doing a traffic impact analysis, they did what was called a mobility study. And that, again, is a much more, what I would call more constructive approach to evaluating the amount of new development that's anticipated in an area that is adjacent to a transit station, and instead of looking for problems with LOS, looking for solutions with regard to what are the ways you can make access to transit work better and how can you increase the transit mode share. However, they were able to use that in the process of getting an environmental impact report certified, and now they're able to tier off of that EIR for individual projects, and they're doing that. And that's another example of what I call pre-SB 743 strategies, because they're really doing a lot of what the law suggests will be done more routinely once the state figures out the guidelines. So I think those are a couple of good examples. I think there may be others in this region. We didn't do an exhaustive analysis of all the good work that's being done in this region, but I know a lot of people are working on that and thinking about it. I wanted to mention one other example, and this goes back to Bill's previous presentation. I've been working as a consultant with ESA and Kaiser Marston on a project up in Temecula Valley where we're actually looking, the Western Riverside Council of Governments received a sustainability grant from SCAG to develop a strategy, and including a financing strategy that looks at this issue of promoting multimodal transportation options in a transit station location. And believe it or not, even though when you drive up I-15, you don't think about regional transit service a lot, there is a transit center being planned on I-15 on the Jefferson Avenue corridor in Temecula, and it'll be the first regional transit center in that area. And so they're developing a specific plan for that area that's considering 45 unit per acre residential and higher density office and hotels, a real kind of a true urban development in Temecula Valley. And as part of that, we're working with them on looking at both the transportation impact analysis, again, doing a more of a multimodal way of looking at that, but we're also looking at this stormwater issue that Bill mentioned and looking at opportunities in Temecula in this same area to do off-site stormwater mitigation in a way that where they can actually, instead of spending all their money on building underground concrete vaults to keep stormwater from flowing off the property, using green infrastructure solutions, using ecological restoration along the creek, and using mini parks that can have bioretention facilities built into them. So basically, instead of doing gray infrastructure, using green infrastructure, meeting needs for parks and other green space in that community, and then developing a financing strategy that sort of puts that into a package and makes that available for developers that would like to invest in that area. So I think that's a really, I think there's a lot of planners now that are sort of understanding the opportunities that SB 743 can lead to, but also thinking about this approach to stormwater and starting to connect the dots. And I think these are good ideas that we'll be recommending, you know, further consideration of in our report to SANDAG.
So in addition to those things, I think what we can anticipate is probably a lot of agencies will be looking to update their significance criteria and maybe their traffic impact analysis guidance. And I think SANDAG will probably need to be playing a role in helping them to understand what tools are available, what other agencies are doing, and maybe some of the pros and cons of applying those other tools in our region. There also is the opportunity to do TOD, you know, streamlining, CEQA streamlining within your review processes. The City of San Diego uses an expedite program. I think other agencies, you know, could use an expedite program for TOD projects. There are some models out there that could be shown to other agencies. Almost all of the streamlining benefits of SB 743 and of CEQA, they require consistency with the sustainable community strategy. Other agencies like SACOG have developed consistency worksheets for their member agencies to use to help determine whether a project's consistent and can use some of the streamlining benefits. It's a pretty simple tool. I think that something like that could be done. And also, as we're rolling out this new model, I think there might need to be some, you know, model validation. And also, one of the SB 743 kind of looks at comparing per capita VMT of projects to a regional per capita average, and that's been the cause of some concern, especially in our region, where, you know, averages I would think would vary greatly depending on the community type. So there may need to be some work done with our agencies to help, you know, determine more area specific and you know, sub-area regional per capita averages. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about model validation, or if that's probably enough for today. Okay. Okay, all right, so that's pretty much what we had on CEQA and travel forecasting.